I need a favor. I have a former colleague and a good friend of mine, Matthew Whittemore, who is probably your biggest fan. So if you could just like look at that camera and say, "Hey, Matthew, Johnny did the thing," I would be very grateful.
Hey, Matthew, Johnny did the thing.
Hey, folks, welcome to Executive Runtime. Today, I have Will Larson, the CTO at Carta and the author of An Elegant Puzzle, Staff Engineer, and the Engineering Executive's Primer. His career spans leadership roles at Stripe, Uber, Calm, amongst others, where he shaped engineering cultures and built global teams. Will, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Super excited to be here.
So I have to start off with a bit of a confession. So the Engineering Executive's Primer is kind of like the perfect entry point to start a conversation, but until you agreed to be on the show, I actually had no idea this book existed. I know you more from An Elegant Puzzle, which is a favorite of mine, and I usually do the audiobooks. So when you said yes, I went to go get the hard copy on Amazon, and that's when I saw you had recently published the new book, which was just perfect in terms of timing. So what was the impetus to writing the Engineering Executive's Primer? Why did you think that book needed to exist?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm always trying to write like a book that doesn't really exist yet, and so like what's something useful? Like there's like so many really good engineering management books out there. Like what do I have to say about engineering management that like 15 people haven't said even better before? But there isn't really like a great engineering executives book out there in my experience. Like when I was in my first like complete executive role at Calm, and before I'd been reporting to the CTO at Stripe. But at Calm, I was the functional lead. There was no one else doing any of it, and so all these issues that kept running into, I was like, hey, how do I work with the finance team more effectively? How do I work on planning? How do I work with my, the head of this other function who's good, but is pissing off all the other functional leads, even though I think they're right. There was just like nowhere that I could actually find it. And so I decided to kind of, after bumbling through myself to pull it together and put it out there. And it's interesting because writing for like smaller audiences, like there's just like fewer people who could buy the book. But I've been trying to think about how do my books help like advance the industry, actually help people. I think helping executives is probably like more impactful than helping almost anyone else in terms of the quality of the actual environments they're creating for others.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious on your take on where most people looking to make the jump from middle management to the executive level, whether it be engineering or otherwise, where do they stumble the most? What's the big takeaway from your recent book, but also just your, experience that people can really learn from?
So right now we're in like a little bit of like a shift of like what middle management is, right? Like what does the industry want from middle managers? And I think 6 years ago, I think people were getting graded on retention. People were getting graded on ability to hire quickly. They were getting graded on kind of like the team's like health and happiness. And now the feedback is like, hey, like why aren't you writing software? Like why aren't you like literally like in the code base? And it's like pretty bewildering experience. You've been raised as a manager to go towards this one direction, and now you're getting pulled in like a totally different direction that you just like haven't spent time developing necessarily. And so people are like, hey, it's a hard time to be a middle manager. But something I really believe is, I think it's always been a hard time to be a middle manager because there's this gap between what you're expected to do as a middle manager and what you're expected to do as an executive. And so I can think of like a greatest story at Uber. When I was at Uber, they decided to roll out bar raisers. So bar raisers kind of a practice copy from Amazon, where there'd be someone from a different part of engineering that would approve each hire. And so let's say infrastructure wanted to hire someone from, growth engineering or product engineering would also have to interview like a senior person, and they had like the final yes or no. And at the time I was like, sure, but let's get some data. Does this actually improve quality of candidates? And I kept raising this as like, hey, how are we going to evaluate if this new practice works? Like, are we sure we're not just like wasting our time here? And I just like kept raising it until basically I was told to like shut up and just do do the rollout. Like that's your job. It's like to shut up. And it's like that. But is it working or not? And I was just like really frustrated that no one cared whether the practice worked or not. And this is as an executive, like what I did was like great. It's like really focused on whether our practices are meaningful, whether they're working. As a middle manager, what I did was like super annoying because like my job in that context was to implement and deploy what had been decided, sort of even if I didn't agree with it. And the challenge is like when you learn to be a great middle manager in this model, you're not actually learning how to be a good exec. So it's like a really challenging transition point. All of a
Yep.
sudden you have to unlearn all of these lessons. And so, hey, I do think it's a hard time to be a middle manager, but I also think it's always been a hard time because we've really been training middle managers to comply, to accept, not to push on like the first principles thinking, which is
Yeah.
exactly what you have to do when you actually cut over into being an exec.
Yeah. Yeah. That resonates with me as well. I used to say that in middle management, depending on where you land, this changes, but you have just enough power to be accountable, but not enough to do like real change. And that can be super frustrating depending on where you are, but in particular in high growth situations where there's so much expectations. Yeah. Similar to that point, one of the things that came up in our prep meeting was this idea of, being an IC versus a manager and sort of like thinking about those executive IC roles, right? Companies like Capital One and even like, all the big tech companies recognize a hierarchy where you remain an IC, but you also are technically an engineering executive. And whether or not that's actually something that managers should be looking at right now, is that actually a career path that's more uh, in favor, at the tops of these companies simply because of the reasons you talked about, or if people should kind of stick it out, stick to the people management, and just figure out, how they actually fit into their organization and that growth trajectory. I'm curious on what you think people should be thinking about when we think about that.
So as we look at like kind of like the broader industry trends, right? Like we've gotten pretty consistent on having like two different career paths. There's like the manager path and there's the individual contributor path where you can get to like staff plus, principal or distinguished or whatever. So we've done a pretty good job of that. But consistently, what I find is like the most companies for these like really senior ICs, they still don't actually get the information they need to do their job unless their manager gives it to them. Like the structure is like, hey, you can be really senior as like an engineer, but then like the systems are like actually you can't see any of this stuff, so you never know. So there's still like an executive team meeting where like the managers are there, and then they might give you the information and they might not. And sometimes they don't give it to you just by accident. It's like usually not like they're hiding information. They just like forget to give a piece of context that's valuable to you. And so I've been experimenting with a couple different strategies over the last, I guess eight some years to try to solve this problem of how do we want to empower our senior most engineers and to actually know things that the managers don't know, but we don't give them information. How do we fix it? And I've tried a couple of things that I think have worked out pretty well, but they're both they're all kind of effectively how do we put like a senior IC in the same rooms as the senior manager or in similar equally privileged rooms. So I can talk about what we tried at Stripe, then I can talk about what we're doing today at Carta. So at Stripe, at some point, I want to say when my team was about like 200-ish some folks, we're really having this problem that the managers couldn't coordinate technically across the areas of the team. So on the person on traffic engineering, which was kind of like networking and like ingress, egress, some other pieces. And then on the compute infrastructure, if the managers tried to coordinate, they just didn't have enough context in the details to actually coordinate meaningfully. So we needed to have like an empowered IC in there. So we rolled out this idea of like pillar tech leads, and we called like each area a pillar. And so that person would have, mostly be in the same meetings as the managers, and they had the authority for that area, just as a manager did, to like make kind of binding top-down decisions. And then that authority kind of rolled up to me. So they basically could act on using my authority as the head of this area within their chunk of it. That worked pretty well. It wasn't perfect. And I think that recurring problem we run into is like one IC just doesn't have the time to know everything and to do all the work. And so just doing it at one layer doesn't really solve the whole problem. Like managers then have like support, like another layer of managers who might have like another layer of managers. This one super senior IC is still just one super senior IC. So they don't really get enough support. But it worked decently well at Stripe. And so I was thinking about how to replicate that at Carta, and we rolled out something that we call the navigators, which is sort of the same construct, but we went like a little bit further. I think one of the challenges is even when I rolled out that approach, the pillar tech leads at Stripe, I didn't have like a good mechanism to get information from me directly to them. So like it still entirely depended on their manager communicating down through them. And so at Carta, what we've done is we have navigators, effectively the same idea as the pillar tech leads, but they're for each area of the business on our, say, our ERP section of the business or our infrastructure section of the business. There's like a very senior IC on same concept. But then I also have like a channel, only me and the navigators. And I try to communicate everything I communicate into the manager channel, communicating there as well. So I'm directly communicating with them. I try like once or twice a year to have like an offsite where we actually meet as a group and talk directly about problem. So I think that there are ways to make these roles real, but it requires consistency. And, one of the challenges in our industry is like as execs turn over, consistency on everything is lost, right? And so I think my hope is that these practices can get a little bit more consistent. Because right now, your ability to be like a really effective super senior IC, really dependent on these systems that are not that common yet. And so I hope we can get more consistent. And so like my thought would be, should we try to encourage more people who are currently moving into management towards these IC tracks? I think like my two thoughts are like one, the systems for these folks to be effective aren't really there at most companies yet. So it's like a little bit challenging. You're super dependent on the structure there. Two, that the things that make those folks so effective are the things they know that the managers don't. And so to me, it's not just like, I'm going to allocate my time differently. Like I would actually have to go back and like reskill myself in a lot of ways to be effective in a senior IC role. And so that's one of the challenges is like, I'm simply not as good of a software engineer as like these senior ICs at this point. I'm like much worse than they are. They've spent the last 20 years like writing software directly. I've spent probably like 5 of the last 20 years writing software directly. It's like it's hard to just pretend I can step back and be equally good.
Have you found that certain leaders at certain organizations understand that dynamic? Or has that something you struggle to communicate up? Like, hey, I can't just jump into this other role just because I have a lot of experience. It's apples and oranges. It's very related, and I understand, the architecture, the concepts there, how to get things built, but I'm not going to be as productive as like the next person who's been doing this and this only for the past 20 years.
Yeah, I think I mean, first, I think what you said is like totally, totally true. And then it's like, what do you do about it? Like, I think like a senior IC has like certain things they have to learn more on like the partnership side, maybe, or the collaboration or stakeholder management or something like that. Are those harder to learn, or is like the technical piece harder to learn? And you can kind of choose to believe what you want to about this stuff. But I just don't know anyone personally who's gone from like the full-time management role back into a senior IC role. So obviously Charity Majors has like the kind of the classic piece on the tech lead manager pendulum. In that I've seen people do that at less executive roles, but I just haven't seen executives do it successfully. But I'm sure there's some counterexamples. And I do think, if you have like a year, you can like ramp back into the stuff you used to be really good at. And maybe right now is like an interesting time. I do think with like the push around LLMs, seeing more companies experiment with like using LLMs to write parts of their software. I think things that make you a good tech lead, but maybe a bad engineer, could also make managers more effective at stepping back in these roles in terms of describing solutions very clearly, but not writing the code directly. Using Cursor or Windsurf or tools like this to actually explain the software and the functions if you don't understand it. maybe it's going to get easier if you have like a great high level, but like weak mid level understanding to kind of go back in. But I don't know, a little bit TBD. The industry is changing a lot right now.
It is changing a lot. And what you said is interesting. I interpret this as a bit of a contradiction, right? Because on one hand, you have companies, pushing for more ICs, less middle management, but at the same time, talking about the benefits of AI, and you don't actually have to write as much code, and it's going to be the communicators who are going to be the most productive moving forward. So for me, it's kind of like a what does the industry want from us? It's sometimes it can be hard to dig into that and dissect that for sure.
I, I don't think the industry knows what they want from us. I think, there was like a period like 5 or 6 years ago, like more where it seemed to me like the industry was moving towards a unionization of tech workers. And then you look at where we are now, the power dynamics have shifted like really dramatically. And so I think what the industry wants from us is what the industry can take from us to a certain extent, right? And so it's not the industry is not like a super like thoughtful thing. It's just like capitalism at some point. And I remember like I don't know what your first jobs were like in tech, but my first job in tech, like I had two one-on-ones with my manager over 2 years. And that was like the only time I interacted with my manager was then. And so people now are like, am I getting career growth from my manager every 3 months? And I'm like, didn't even talk to my manager every 3 months. And so it was like a different era. And now parts of what's happening now feel like a lot more like that era that I entered in than the era we
Mhm.
were kind of in the interim.
Yeah, definitely aligns with my experience. It was a little bit better than a couple times a year, but no more than once a month with my manager. So yeah, things have changed a lot for sure. Speaking of early career, so you were also at Yahoo and Digg for a little bit. So I'm curious on how those early roles kind of shaped your perspective on engineering and management, your personal transition from, individual contributor to Yahoo to director of engineering and Digg. What was that journey like, and what did you learn along the way?
So I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, small kind of small city. I think it's like 90,000 people there or something like that. Then I went to school at a small university in Kentucky. I think 1,300 students in the student population. But then my computer science class had maybe five graduates my year, like five of them. And so we
Yeah.
didn't really know how to get like jobs or like get into the industry. We didn't really the amount of wisdom in that group was pretty narrow. So something I started doing was I started writing. It's like, hey, if I don't know how to get like a good job in technology, and so I actually taught English in Japan for a year. But I started writing, and I was like, hey, writing. I developed this thesis of kind of how do you create meaningful content, and my thesis was basically you wait for something new to happen, then you write a ton of stuff on it, useful stuff, really quickly, and you kind of get out in front of kind of other people writing about it. And so I did that for, I think Django was already like well on its way, but I tried to do that for Django. I did that for this like OSX bridge between like Cocoa and Python. I did that for like Why the Lucky Stiffs, like shoes projects back in like,
Mhm.
I don't know, 08 or 09 or something. And then I also did it for something called Yahoo Boss, like build your own search service. And that's actually where I first got in touch with Yahoo. Is I just wrote about their new release. It was a pretty cool idea. Basically, it was an API to get search results from their the entire like web corpus of that Yahoo had, and you could build your own like search experiences on top of it. And so I got in touch with them, or they got in touch with me rather, and then slowly over the course of like 9 months, that turned into my first job. Working at Yahoo, and it almost like didn't happen a number of times because Yahoo went through I think 6 rounds of layoffs over like a 3 year period, and so the headcount kept getting frozen and stuck. And so I was hired as a contractor. I was working remotely from the East Coast with a team that everyone else was much more senior than me, working in Sunnyvale, California. But I was just like really grateful to have a job, right? And so I think I did such a bad job negotiating that the recruiter called me back and was like, actually, like we're gonna pay you more because you did such a bad job negotiating the offer. I'm like, okay. They're like, you're just gonna quit in a year if you take this offer. So here's a little bit more. It's like fantastic. He's like, this has never happened before. I'm like, okay, that's not that reassuring to me. But anyway, I didn't know what I was doing, which is fine. So I went there. But it was like it was a pretty interesting time to be like early. So I was, this was like great financial crisis kind of era. I was really grateful to have a job. I've been spending a ton of time like running my own servers, like provisioning stuff, debugging, like just with no support. And so I was kind of used to that. And that's basically the environment I came into. I was the first front end engineer on that team, the only front end engineer on that team, which I really wasn't qualified, but none of them wanted to do it. And so I was just like the one front end engineer. They were all again in different time zones. It was actually a team composed of a few other teams that were kind of shoved together that did not get along very well with each other. But I was just like really grateful to like have a job, right? And so I was just in there grinding, trying to figure out how to make the pieces work. And I think they appreciated that. I think I got a lot done considering I had effectively no experience or knowledge coming into that. They brought me full time and moved me out kind of a year into it. It's kind of like classic, like a lot of these bigger companies, either you convert into contractor or you're fired after 1 year because they're trying to maintain this separation. And so they're basically either you move out to California or you're fired. Like you have like 2 days to decide. And so yeah, sure, let's move out. And it was really, really fascinating kind of place to come into. It was like Yahoo's like a generational company, but of like a different generation. And by the time I was coming into it, it was shrinking. It was going through a lot of layoffs. They'd have like 3 or 4 CEOs in the past like 4 years. It was just going through like a challenge time. But I learned so much from that. And it was deeply instructive. But one of the things I learned, which is like a personal feeling that I kind of continue to have to this day, is if I can't make progress, I get pretty frustrated. And so like in certain circumstances, this is a strength. This is like being demanding. This is like having a high pace. In other circumstances, this is like having a bad attitude. And so it's like I have this like thesis of people don't really have strengths and weaknesses. They have characteristics that demonstrate themselves in good and bad ways, depending on the circumstances they're in. And so I think these characteristics like were really good for the first like 18 months. And then as we basically, Yahoo sold the search business to Microsoft. So we weren't allowed to launch anything, but the deal was still in discussion. So we weren't allowed to do anything for 6+ months. And I just really, really wanted to do something. And so my product manager left, Dosh. He went to Digg. And I also went, some like 3 to 6 months later, because I was just like, there's nothing to do. And so I ended up at Digg, and that was kind of like the classic Silicon Valley story. It was, hey, if you join, worst case, you're going to make like 200, 300K in the next year. Best case, you're gonna, make a lot of money. Amazing products. I accept the offer. The CEO gets fired the Friday before I start. I start. We have like the worst product launch of all time, Digg V4, like 4 to 6 months afterwards. Then they basically fire almost everyone. Went from like 100+ people down to like 20-ish people. And I ended up running the engineering team just because there was like no one else left. And so I think at that time I had like 2 months of management experience of like 3 people and sort of a little bit trial by fire, right? But I do think there's this interesting reality, which has been really true in my career, which is if you know what you want, you can usually get it as long as you're willing to accept a lot of downsides, the other piece of it. And so I got to learn how to manage. I got to move into this role. I got to set the direction of this, I think, iconic, albeit like struggling company. Everything was terrible outside of that, though. Like, everyone with tenure had quit. All the experienced managers had quit. We were running out of money. People were literally threatening to kill us on Twitter. Things weren't like that good, you could argue. But it really gave me like so much so much learning, and I took so much away from it. And I think to me that was like, I think kind of an unlock in my career, like, well, on two dimensions, right? Like first it was, I got this experience, I got this title that no one would have given me. I was probably like 24, but I was just like
Hmm.
too dumb to quit. And they just kept giving me more stuff because they needed someone. And like, I'll be honest, I actually like wanted to quit at various points, but I couldn't find anyone to like give notice to because the CEO was gone. There was no HR team. And I was like, how do I quit? Like,
Yeah.
there's no one to tell. Like, but
Yeah.
who do I go to? And so I just like couldn't figure out how to quit. And so like, eventually we got like acquired. But I learned so much from it. And what I learned from that was, if you have clarity about what you're trying to accomplish and are willing to compromise in everything else, you can almost always accomplish what matters to you. But
Yeah.
you have to be willing to compromise in almost everything else. And so that's how I got into my first management role. That's that I was wildly unqualified for, but also that no one else would have taken. And started my path. And so that was pretty learned a lot. Was a painful way to do it.
Yeah. That's quite a turbulent transition into management. But it sounds like you got a lot out of it. So it's great. Something you said early on that was pretty funny about the offer negotiation and the recruiter coming back to you kind of brings up a topic that is actually timely for our audience, which is what do people generally get wrong when they're thinking about negotiating offers at an executive level?
I think that the challenge of executive offers is that there's so many variables you can bring into play, right? And so I think like, I think of like executive roles as like one of one. So like it's kind of like bespoke, artisanal, custom thing. And it's not like so like, okay, you want to interview to be like a senior engineer or staff engineer. People are going to tell you things like, hey, you need to go interview with like 6 different companies, get like 3 or 4 offers, leverage them against each other. Executive offers are like, don't really work that way in practice. It's like, first, it's incredibly hard to get multiple executive offers at the same time because executive roles, like good executive roles, are sort of like opportunistic. They pop up for brief windows, and either you're available or you're not, but then they disappear in like a month or 2 months. The really good ones. There are also like roles that are not as good that linger for a long time, but there's something, they're lemons. You don't know why they're lemon, but they're lemons. And so you can't just like get 2 offers and use them to drive the other one up. In part because just the timing's impossible, but also in part because as an executive, you're going to have many different negotiations with the CEO on like many different topics. You're trying to like set like a good foundation of like partnering. And so you have to pick like what matters to you. But people can do this so many different ways. Like I've seen people bring in lawyers. I've seen people bring like really negotiate like every term. Like hey, I want like business travel. Like you can negotiate that in your contract. Um, you can negotiate, the timing, like do you have a cliff or not? Like a lot of people will try to negotiate that and try to remove like the 12-month cliff. You can negotiate like ISOs versus RSUs versus splits. And this is the core challenge. There's just so much. I think what I try to remember though, you can negotiate acceleration in terms like, hey, if there's an acquisition, how much does your stuff accelerate or not? I think that the thing that I try to remember is something that like someone told me actually during the Digg kind of attempt to get acquired. He's like, it doesn't actually matter what's in your contract because the acquiring company can set any kind of stipulations they want. And if the deal doesn't get done unless they're accepted, they get accepted. And so like a concrete example of this is like, let's say you have like early, you have acceleration. And so if we get acquired, all of my equity vests immediately. Amazing, right? But then if the acquirer is like, hey, we won't acquire you unless you like forego the acceleration and give a bunch of the cash, the equity back, and then reset the vesting period. Your choices are like, you can say, screw you, I'm not going to do that. But then you're not going to acquire. And then people are going to be, angry with you about that. And so you can use that as like the lever to negotiate like some sort of concessions. Like maybe you give back 2/3 of your equity, but not like 100%. Yeah, you have like lots of like options, right? But simply having it in a contract doesn't mean you'll actually get it. It's just it means you are entitled to it in principle, but like reality is really complex and detailed. And so like my biggest advice is that he'll get so much advice about the correct way to do things. And it's important for you to understand what you're signing and the implications of what you're signing. And you have to pick one or two things that you care about a lot that you're actually willing to walk away. And so like for one that, I think a lot of people care about is the ability to retain your equity somehow. And so that could be RSUs instead of ISOs. That could be like a longer post termination, like exercise window. You have like lots of pieces you can negotiate there. But you can't like negotiate everything. You have to like pick one or two that matter to you enough that you can walk away because you're also establishing like your baseline as like a person they want to work with. So it is a tricky one to balance. Um, I'd say, what I just said, that's like one set of advice. The other piece though is just like getting informed on like what other people have in terms of offers. And I think that you also learn about them, right? And I think part of what I think you want to discover as you go through this executive offer approval process is, do they actually want you? And are they demonstrating that? And are they competent? And so if someone comes to you with an offer that is sort of doesn't feel respectful, they could be like, do they just not know what they're doing? And then do you want to like spend the next 10 years working with someone who you have to really educate on kind of the basics? And maybe you do. Maybe like all the other pieces are really good, but you're like, hey, this person like didn't even like talk to a compensation consultant, didn't get like equity bands, didn't talk to like four of their friends about like what this role should be. They just made up an offer that doesn't really resonate with me. Or like, hey, they actually know they're lowballing me. And to me, I guess like at this point in my career, one of the things I personally care about a lot is being wanted. And like, hey, if you don't want me, that's actually fine. Like we just shouldn't be working together, right? And so if you come to me with an offer that doesn't make sense, that's fine. Like let's just not work together at that point. And I think you have to like let people show you who they are, and you have to take that at face value. You don't have to like make up like complicated narratives. And then you have to walk sometimes, which is hard, particularly when you're getting your first executive offer or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, those are really good insights. It does seem like the process at that level is just very, very bespoke. You made a point earlier, and you made this point in your book as well. I want to maybe talk a little bit more about it. I don't want to say the red flags, but I guess you call them lemons, but jobs that have been around for a while. Are there any other signs that you can think of that people should be looking out for jobs that may not necessarily be good to go after and not waste your time? Or should they still go after them? But what are the right questions to ask to kind of understand, why this role has been open for as long as it has? I'm curious on your advice there.
I think there's basically like two types of one-ins. There are really good jobs where the hiring manager isn't decisive enough to like make a decision that will get someone hired. I was at like a dinner, like an executive dinner recently, and someone said they were hiring a CFO and they interviewed 102 CFO candidates.
Oh, wow.
And then people were like, yeah, decisive, strong leader. And it's like, whoa, something went wrong. Something went wrong there. And I don't know what went wrong there. And like my guess is could have been they refocused on the right candidate profile very late, where they had to see like a ton to realize they actually didn't want like a more experienced industry leader. They wanted like more of an up and comer. I don't know
Yeah.
what they did wrong, but that's actually like a reflection on the hiring manager not knowing how to like manage the loop. A different version, like when I started at Stripe, one of the big problems we had for hiring was there'd be like a lot of like mixed signal, and the hiring managers would be like, well, there's mixed signal, so I don't know what to do. I guess we're just not going to hire them. And we had to work on the hiring manager has to have conviction about what to do. Like they have to collect the feedback, and then they have to make like a high conviction decision. If we just average out like all the feedback, then like my guess is they would have like a really good like hiring manager. And I think that's like a reflection on the hiring manager not knowing how to like manage the loop. A different version, like when I started at Stripe, one of the big problems we had for hiring was there'd be like a lot of like mixed signal, and the hiring managers would be like, well, there's mixed signal, so I don't know what to do. I guess we're just not going to hire them. And we had to work on the hiring manager has to have conviction about what to do. Like we just let kind of, if we just average out like all the feedback, we often just won't get there. You also have to like remove interviewers who give like low signal feedback too. That's like a different problem. But
Yeah.
the first one is like, hey, you just see people who just like can't decide who to offer to, and you'll see some signals for this. Like they'll often change the executive recruiting firm. Like if you see like a role change executive recruiters, it's because the executive recruiters have like fired the customer for that role, and they just for whatever reason they can't get them to like align on a candidate they want to make an offer to.
Yeah.
So that's like one where it's not that the jobs might actually be good, but there's just like no chance you or anyone else are going to get the job because they're
Mhm.
looking for like you'll see a ton hiring managers talk about like, oh, I just want to have that like feeling about the candidate. You're like, all right, like this job is busted. Like no one's going to get this job offer. Like what does it mean? Like I don't want to
Yeah.
spend time with that. So that's one. The other one is like a little bit to like the job is the hiring manager is like a good hiring manager, but like there's something wrong about the job. And so this goes back to the kind of the learning from Digg and, same at Uber. Like Uber was a very intense place to work at the time I worked there. Um, Joining Uber was not uniformly fun. But I had like a really clear goal. And my goal was, hey, I've been managing a team of like 10 roughly at the company that acquired Digg. As like I want to be running like an entire engineering organization, but like I look at these jobs and I think I haven't managed enough people in like a complex enough environment to actually get there. So like how do I get
Yeah.
to a larger role? And no one's gonna hire me for a larger role. So I have to go somewhere that's doing a ton of hiring. And so I was like, all right, gonna go to Uber. And then like it worked out. Like it hired really, really quickly. And then again, accepting all the other consequences of I got exactly what I was looking for. And there were lots of like consequences that weren't as good. Going back to the exec roles, sometimes you should take a lemon, right? Because you know exactly what you want. And maybe your goal is like, I want to break into my first executive role. And I have conviction from talking to exec recruiters that I'm just not a good candidate because I haven't worked at a role like this. And so I need to take any reasonable role even though I know that this company's not growing that well, even though I know that this exec team is not harmonious, or even though I know that we're struggling with product market fit. And again, as long as you know what you're doing and you're accomplishing this thing that's important to you, there's all these other like side consequences you can just accept as things you're going to have to manage through. And there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, I think that's an important thing to do when you're trying to break in to find the first opportunity. Sometimes these things are good. Sometimes they're not as good. And the reality is, unless you're coming from like a really high prestige environment and interview really well, you do have to like climb. You don't just like jump to where you're going. And if you jump to where you're going, you probably don't know how to do the job. And anyway, so climbing is valuable on like a lot of dimensions as well.
Yeah.
And so I think it's not that you should never take one of these jobs that have been like lingering. I think you should. You just have to understand like you're making like a bit of a bargain, and there are consequences when you make the bargain. And I think where people get into a lot of trouble is they convince themselves all these problems won't be real, and they are going to
Mhm.
be real. That's the bargain you're making, and you just have to be honest with yourself about that.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious on your take on this concept of contextual leadership versus playbooks. So one of the shared stories you have is kind of learning at Stripe that, solutions that work there don't necessarily work at Uber, which I can definitely relate to. But there's also a different sort of approach where I've seen leaders come in and like they have their playbook, right? They've done things a certain way in the past, and for better or for worse, they push that through the culture. They may even have like their people that they bring in. And there could be advantages that if certain people have like a shorthand, but I'm curious on what's been your approach to balancing those two dynamics and when to lean on one versus the other?
I think this is an interesting question. I think if you go through like an interview loop for an executive, you'll hear two different ideas for every executive. I love that they have a playbook. They know exactly what to do. Like, oh, they're too anchored on their playbook. They're not going to really understand how we do work.
Yeah.
It's like, what do you mean? Like, you can't, of course, they're going to be one or the other. Like that doesn't make that much sense. And so I think that the trick is like good executives have to know, um, they have to have a playbook. They have to know when to use the playbook. And they have to know how to use the playbook in a way that people feel seen and heard, and not like their history has been like erased on them. And so I can think of like a few different examples of this. And so when I came into Stripe, I was just off this move from like the Uber's like Python like monolithic like application into to services using for us Mesos Aurora at that time, but we were kind of, Kubernetes was getting some traction, and it kind of seemed like Kubernetes was probably the right path to go at that point. And one of my things is like, hey, we have this monolithic Ruby application. Let's figure out how we get and we're running on like VMs at that point. Let's get to Kubernetes, and we can start like moving away from dealing with the VMs directly, moving to like a little bit of a higher abstraction. And I just like I could not convince the senior most engineer working that space in Nelson that it made any sense. And I spent a while, but eventually I wasn't really understanding some of his pushback. And I was like, hey, what could I prove to you in the rollout that would change your mind? And he was like, there was nothing you could do that would change my mind. And I was like, well, maybe I'll focus on something else right now. Because it
Yeah.
wasn't, I could have forced it through. And Nelson's like a really smart guy. I have like a ton of respect for him.
Hmm.
But from his perspective, this just didn't matter at all. And so we basically tabled that approach for, like a year, 18 months. And then we came back to it when we had like a clearer like set of use cases that did resonate like a little bit more with him, but also like with others and kind of the teams that would be benefiting from it. So I think, add the playbooks. But I think in that moment you have like two choices. You could be like, hey, this guy's pushing back. Like I'm this new senior leader. I need to like establish like dominance. So I'm just going to push it through. Or it could be like, I don't understand why this guy's pushing back, but like I'm new here. There must be a reason why he's pushing back, even if I don't understand it right now. So it's like, let's create a little bit of space. And I think that the challenge is like why people push back on things is like very variable. And so I think Stripe was like extremely talent dense organization. So when people and like a very complicated business. And so when people were pushing back and I didn't understand, is like there's probably a reason why they're pushing back and I don't understand. And it's like probably me. I think sometimes, when you go into other organizations, like you don't know how to assess the talent density early on. And so you have to like make like a judgment call. Like maybe I should push a little bit harder. It's not just talent density. It's like sometimes like one of the awkward things is like increasingly as you get deeper into your career, like you are the most experienced person in like rooms that you're in, but you also are like missing, to your point, some of the context of it. And so I do think you have to have like some courage to push and also, and, and then find out if you're wrong. And so when I came into Calm, there was, a service decomposition happening. It was sort of like every company was decomposing like a monolith into services at that point. And they had shipped zero things they decomposed over like 18 months, something like that. And so to me, it was like, this is a failed migration. We're just gonna stop. And it really frustrated, I think, roughly two people. I think everyone else though was like, yeah, this is a disaster. Like let's stop. And like two people I think were really upset. And like I just couldn't convince them. And I spent like a fair amount of time trying to get them on board. But to them, it was like the right thing to do. And the fact that it wasn't working was sort of like independent of that. And I was like, hey, it is now my job to have like the point of view and to like break some ties. And so this is what I'm breaking. Um, and I think, I definitely remember being that person who was kind of unconvincible early in my career. And I think something I used to believe that I don't believe at all anymore, kind of relevant to context, is I used to believe that like I had all the context and I had made the correct decision. And now I know like I've made the correct decision, usually based on what I know, but I'm also missing a ton of stuff. And so like even though like I'm smart and have good judgment, I'm still wrong a lot just because I have like the wrong information very, very frequently. And I think negotiating with people who haven't learned that yet is sort of folly because like they're actually wrong. You can't perceive that they're wrong. And sometimes you do just have to push a little bit. And that to like the opening question, that's the challenge. Like sometimes there's people who have really good judgment and are really smart, but are still wrong a lot because they don't realize what they don't know. And I do think that things like playbooks are good examples of places you do just have to ram things through if the objections are only coming from folks like that.
We're getting close to time here, but one thing I definitely wanted to hit on was writing. This is a skill set that I personally believe is highly underrated for all levels of professionals, but particularly at the leadership level. You have 3 books, an extensive blog archive, and it's become a significant part of your professional identity, at least from my perspective. How has writing contributed to your career growth and leadership journey?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's kind of like three different eras of writing for me professionally.
Hmm.
Maybe four, who knows? There'll be more in the future. So coming right out of college, well, actually, while I was still at college, I was like, hey, I don't know how to get a job in technology. So I'm going to try to create some awareness of me and hope that will turn into a job somehow, which could have been a better, more structured idea, but did ultimately work. So hey, let's say that worked well. But mostly what I was writing about was just like stuff that I was learning. So it was like like most of my early stuff was like tutorials. Like it took
Hmm.
me a while. Like I was experimenting with different stuff for a year or two, just trying to write a bunch of different things. But then like I almost exclusively wrote like very thorough tutorials, and tutorials trying to solve this problem of most tutorials like skip steps. And so you're following along and all of a sudden it's like 2 steps down. You're like, how do I get there? Like, I don't know how to get there. So I tried to have like tutorials that didn't skip any steps. Like that was like the key thing I was focused on,
Yeah.
mostly around Django, mostly around like Python, kind of at that like 2008, 2009, 10 kind of
Yeah.
window. Um, then I did break into the industry, and that was kind of amazing, right? Then I really stopped writing that much for a while. Like I was learning a lot, but I think the experience, I'd say like the Digg, the company that acquired Digg, the Uber experiences were pretty intense, and they didn't leave like a lot of like open space. And so one of the things I realized was that I kept getting this cycle where I learned a lot and I make a ton of progress, but then I hit this like pocket of kind of like slow progress. It's like I'm not going to get promoted for the next like 18 months, or I've accumulated this scope, and I'm not going to get more scope. Or we've had this like huge problem around, like when I started at Uber, we had to migrate between our peak data center into a new data center. So we had to do like a massive data center migration, and this was like no cloud, just like real physical servers. So there was like the data center migration. They were splitting to like operate in like 2 data centers, and there's like rolling out into Uber China, and then like rolling back from Uber China. There's the services migrations, but then like things got like relatively slow, and almost anything feels slow after you've been kind of working in that chaos. And so I just felt like this real need for progress, but I couldn't get it, and so that was like super frustrating for me at that point. And so as I
Hmm.
thought about going to Stripe, like one of my goals was like, hey, I realized that I need like another outlet because I do really well when there's like an intense, clear focus. But when there isn't, I feel like I feel stuck and I have like all this energy that I need to channel somewhere. And it's like, it's not helping me. It's not helping my team. It's not helping anyone. It's like, all right, why don't I try like channeling that into writing? And
Hmm.
that is in part, I think I think Patrick Collison and Stripe was very kind of tolerant, excited for people to be writing. I think it was the first place I worked at where people were excited for their authors to be publishing. And it wasn't like a review. It was just like, go publish the stuff you want. And if it's really bad, maybe we'll fire you. Like in like offensive sort of bad. The quality was poor. They didn't care, although they certainly weren't going to be excited for it. But they actually like celebrated this versus kind of like maybe tolerating it at best. And to me, it really worked out. And so gave me both something that was good for the company in terms of like having writing, but also like a place to channel all this energy when for whatever reason, like the job work was like a little bit stuck, like just needed more time, was waiting for a decision to be made, something like that. But also like Stripe was this like huge pocket of learning for me. I learned so much. I learned so much at every one of my job. But I think Stripe, just the rate of growth, the different things we were trying, kind of our privileged spot in terms of like having access to like how other companies were doing it, because it was like a super well networked company across the valley. And so just started writing more, and that kind of like turned into this book, An Elegant Puzzle. And that again, immense credit to I think Brianna Wilson, who helped like kind of turn that book into the writing into a book. Kind of the original founder of Stripe Press. But that was really like transformative for me, and I realized like, hey, this is a way that I can like further my career, but it's also like something I can own. And I think as a manager, again, this like you do lose your ability to like make progress as an individual as a manager. And like something I care about a lot is like there's this pride of craft. But as
Hmm.
like a manager, you actually don't get to own that much craft. Like your team owns the craft a lot of the time. Like they're the people doing the work.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you actually demonstrate craft as a manager is like, I think a really hard problem to solve in
Hmm.
the context of your work. You have to find like some other avenue. And so that's kind of where it started. And then it's grown like bit from there.
Well, before we go, I need a favor. I have a former colleague and a good friend of mine, Matthew Whittemore, who is probably your biggest fan. So if you could just like look at that camera and say, "Hey, Matthew, Johnny did the thing," I would be very grateful.
Hey, Matthew, Johnny did the thing.
Excellent. Any parting words for our audience before we jump?
Maybe my parting thought is I think, you know, being an executive is truly like a one-of-one role. There's like a ton of advice. Like every situation is like meaningfully different. And so, take the advice, take other people's experiences, but don't learn too much from them. Like there's always stuff that only applies to you that no one will ever be able to tell you.
Great. So, Will, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it. You were super gracious to appear on the show, and thanks again.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Johnny. This is great.
If you enjoyed today's guest and you'd like to help support the show, please subscribe, leave a rating, and share this episode. As always, thank you to our listeners, and be sure to tune in to the next episode of Executive Runtime.